Hello everyone and welcome to the first Thursday Club for December, the last one of the year. Today we're going to be hearing from Steph and Catherine talking about the upcoming COP15 in Montreal and what it might mean. Yeah, so for those of you who have not been on a first Thursday Club before, we mute everybody's microphones, of course, but it doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. There is a option to pop a question in on the side of the panel there, and we'd like as many questions as possible, please, throughout the presentation. What I'll do while the other two are talking is go and look at those questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end in a Q&A. But those that we don't get round to, we will answer via email. After the presentation, we'll send out a questionnaire, and it would be great if you could just take 5 minutes to fill that in. It helps us tweak what we're doing with the First Thursday Clubs. But yeah, so today's speakers, hopefully we'll be hearing from Dr. Steph Wray, if the internet bears up. She's a director of both RSK Biosensors and Nature Positive. She's also the Chief Sustainability Officer for the RSK Group. And just in her spare time, because she's always got loads, she's also the president of the Mammal Society and the ex-chair of the Strategic Policy Panel for SAIEM. She's also going to be going to Montreal next week, and so this is largely to talk about what she's going to find when she's there. Our second speaker is Catherine Risk. She joined Nature Positive about 18 months ago, I think, something like that. She's an associate director and focused on the delivery of sustainability and biodiversity strategies and advice. She translates complex sustainability issues into practical solutions for companies to implement. And Catherine has experience assessing biodiversity impacts of a company's operations and supply chain, and can use this experience to support clients to identify their key risks and work towards becoming nature positive. So without further ado, I'll hand over to hopefully Catherine and Steph, and we'll see what they say. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody can hear me at all, so somebody's probably going to have to say whether I've got enough bandwidth for you to hear what I'm saying before I carry on. No.
We can hear you, Steph. Carry on.
You can? Okay. I just got a message saying you're going to have to start. Right. Thanks very much then. Hopefully the internet will hold on through this section of the talk. So what we're going to talk about today between Catherine and myself, possibly entirely Catherine if I keep having these difficulties, is what is COP15, what we're expecting to come out of the meeting in Montreal over the next couple of weeks, but then what it might mean for your businesses. And then Catherine's going to talk a little more around the implications for business, how you can understand your impacts on biodiversity, understand where your baseline issues are, and develop strategies and action plans for reducing those impacts and reinvesting in the ecosystem services you rely on. So hopefully you might see the next slide in a second. I've got a very slow connection for no adequately explored reason. I'm going to try again. I'm probably going to move on 2 slides now. No, I'm sorry, don't seem to have any control over the slides at all. Catherine, if you could give us the next slide. Okay, what is COP15 then? The other COP, we hear a lot about COP27. That's just happened in Egypt, and people speculating over whether the Prime Minister would attend or not, and what would come out of the climate negotiations at Sharm el-Sheikh. But we see much less comment and media interest in the biodiversity COP. And that's quite possibly, if I could have next slide, please, Catherine. That's quite possibly because people don't necessarily know what biodiversity is. And there have been surveys of the public which have suggested that the most popular answer to the question, what is biodiversity, was that it's a washing powder. It is, in fact, the whole range of all of the diversity of everything that's alive on the planet, including the genetic diversity amongst those species. Next slide, please. But that's quite a complicated complicated thing to keep in your head. You might also just refer to this as nature or the natural environment, and that's probably a lot more useful in trying to understand what biodiversity and what COP15 is all about. Next slide, please. So that's biodiversity. Why does it matter? Well, biodiversity is at the heart of all of the goods and services that we rely on to sustain all of our societies and our economies. And it's been calculated by the World Economic Forum that more than half of global GDP is dependent or highly dependent on biodiversity. So we call these goods and services that are provided by nature ecosystem services, and we divide them into these 4 types of service. The provisioning services, that's things that we harvest directly from nature, like food and minerals, fibres, timber and fuels. The supporting services, and these are what sits underneath those things that we harvest, the production of soil, the primary production, which is the sort of fixing of carbon from sunlight by plants, forming that into habitats, nutrient cycling amongst the natural world. Then we've got the regulating services, which are things like flood management, preventing erosion, provision of pure water to drink, carbon management and climate regulation. So yes, climate, the one that we get much more press attention for, is really just a subset of ecosystem services. It's just one of the issues of many that we need to be thinking about. And then finally, the cultural services. These are where we rely on nature for educational or spiritual things, where it's good. We all know that being out in nature is good for our health and for our mental well-being. How we use nature for recreation and leisure time, and just that kind of going out into a forest and looking upwards and through the trees and being taken aback at how beautiful it is. Those sorts of services that are much harder to put a price on. But we know that improving biodiversity improves the provisioning of these services and can support communities in thriving. We also know that that biodiversity is intricately linked with climate change, and we can't solve one of those existential crises without solving the other as well. Next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, now biodiversity loss is occurring at an unprecedented rate. And on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see the sort of 5 main drivers of that. These were identified in the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment, and those are overexploitation of species, so directly harvesting too much from nature before it can replenish itself. Changes in land use, so habitat loss or just habitat degradation through our activities like development and agriculture. Invasive species or diseases, and that's through our own activities. For example, if we're opening up a road into a previously uninhabited area to develop a mine or to progress with agriculture, then that can cause species movements. It can allow access for other activities like illegal logging, for example. Climate change, of course, is one of those big drivers of biodiversity loss. And then finally, pollution across a range of different types of pollution, to ground, to water, or to air. So we've seen huge changes in the population sizes of mammals, birds and fish, amphibians and reptiles since 1970. Huge proportion of those are currently threatened with extinction. Next slide, please. So how is COP15 going to address all of this? So COP15 is the conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that convention was signed at the Earth Summit in 1992, and the parties have met every other year since then, up until when this meeting should have taken place in 2020. It was originally supposed to happen in Kunming in China, but for various COVID-related reasons, it's been postponed several times. But China will still hold the presidency this year, though it's now taking place in Montreal in Canada. So COP15 will bring together the parties themselves, the countries from all over the world, to look at the targets to tackle this crisis, but it'll also bring together lots of NGOs, businesses, non-state actors, members of civil society in being as inclusive as possible in developing this new framework, which is called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is a really important step forward because we've been setting biodiversity targets before through the CBD process, and in the meeting in 2011 in Japan, we set targets to take us up to the year 2020. None of those targets were achieved. So these new targets are hugely important in how we're taking forward the global response to this crisis. Next slide, please, Catherine. So what needs to happen? Well, we're looking for four things. We're looking for an equitable framework with resources to actually implement it. We're looking for very clear targets that are deliverable to address those threats that we've just talked about. We want that plan to safeguard the rights of Indigenous people and recognises that they have a role as in stewardship of nature and recognises their contributions. And then we want to make sure that finance for biodiversity is moving forward. There's a lot of talk about finance into biodiversity, but we want to make the pathways for it to actually flow towards more sustainable investment and away from environmentally harmful ones. Next slide, please. So what does the framework look like? Well, this is an overview. So overarching all of it, we have the 2050 vision of a world living in harmony with nature, and that's obviously a very lofty aim, and so it's broken down into four main goals for 2050. They're around nature conservation for its own sake. They're about preservation of ecosystem services that we all rely on. It's about access to nature and making sure that we equitably share the benefits from nature, and it's making sure that the finance flows are there and are aligned with nature positive outcomes. So within that, we have a 2030 mission that we want to see biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. So by 2050, nature has recovered. We've seen ecosystem restoration. We see the world using nature in a more sustainable way. By 2030, we need to have bent that curve on biodiversity loss and flipped it from loss back to regeneration. Now, underneath the mission, there's 21 targets at the moment, and they're divided into three main areas. If I can have the next slide, around reducing threats, mainstreaming these actions, and sustainable use and benefit sharing. So I'm not going to talk about all of the targets, but just to sort of highlight a few of them where we talk about reducing threats, of relevance to some of the businesses that you all work with, will be around spatial planning, how we build biodiversity and ecosystem services concerns into how we go about planning. And obviously there have been steps in that direction in the UK around biodiversity net gain in England, and similar regimes being developed in Scotland and Wales. There's target 7 around pollution. Now that's around chemicals and things like pesticides, so water pollution and so forth. Some of it is around air pollution. Some of it's around nutrients, and you'll have seen the huge impacts of nutrient neutrality regulations in England recently. Obviously, it links to climate change. It's believed that 30% of the global climate mitigation efforts will be based on nature. So it's essential for us to deliver our nature targets. Moving then on to benefit sharing, we've got the sustainable use target, which is making sure that the things that we use, not just the things that we use directly, but the things that we rely on in our supply chains. So if we have any agricultural products in our supply chains, if we rely on any textiles, for example, so if you have PPE in your business, where is that coming from? Where's your cotton being grown? What pollution is it causing? How much water is it using? And so forth. The related target of target 10, making sure that all areas under agriculture or aquaculture and forestry indeed are managed sustainably and contributing to ecosystem resilience. And then of course we've got We've got the implementation and mainstreaming targets. So mainstreaming it, we're making sure that this feeds out throughout the whole of our economy. It's not just something that departments of the environment need to worry about, or strange environmentalists like me. It's around at every level of society. Target 15 is a big one for business. This is around mandatory reporting of impacts on biodiversity and seeking to reduce those negative impacts by 50% towards full sustainability. So this is in line with, for example, the TCFD reporting regime for climate. It's suggesting an equivalent mandatory reporting regime for nature. And then we've got targets around sustainable consumption, sustainable finance, making sure that finance flows are moving towards nature positive actions and moving away from environmentally harmful subsidies. It's estimated that 2% of global GDP is currently spent on subsidizing actions which are harmful to the environment and the ecosystem services that we all rely on. So the aim is to not just stop those subsidies, but to redirect them into more positive actions. Next slide, please. So what does success look like? Well, what we're hoping for is that we will get to an agreement. Sometimes it runs up to the wire a little bit during these negotiations, but we hope we'll get to an agreement. And then that will be the equivalent of a Paris agreement, the Paris climate agreement for nature. So it's clear, unambiguous, legally binding targets. We need to make sure that the actions are seen as urgent, that we need to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, which is only 8 years away. It's an awful lot to do. And so in order to deliver these aims of the new framework, it will need transformational change. This isn't just business as usual plus a little bit. This is really rethinking how we do business, rethinking our supply chains and re-engineering our processes to make sure that we can live in harmony with nature. Next slide, please. Now, we have known about this for a little while. It's not something that we've suddenly learned, that we're damaging nature through our approach to resource consumption. So you might think that business was probably all over this already, being the innovative, creative force that it is. So this is some work that we did last year, looking at the FTSE 100 to see what they're doing about biodiversity, and almost half of them, in fact slightly more than half, either made no mention of biodiversity at all, identified it as an issue that wasn't material to their business, or just mentioned it in passing or indirectly. So they really had no concept of how their business relied on biodiversity. And it's the evidence we found, which is purely from their published information, showed that only a quarter of FTSE companies were doing any kind of audit of biodiversity, and only 3%, if they were doing that, were looking across their entire value chain rather than just at their direct operations. And as Catherine will come on to in a minute, in your value chain is really where you need to be looking. Next slide. So how can you engage? Well, please sign up to the Business for Nature call for action. Nature is everyone's business. If you work in the finance sector, join the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. Possibly now slightly too late to come to Montreal, but if you are able to join online at least, between the 17th and the 19th of December, there are activities around business. Join in with existing networks and initiatives. Subscribe to the Capitals Coalitions, subscribe to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development activities, and demonstrate, really put pressure on leaders to understand that business wants this, business wants to work with this, and it is a priority in all of our businesses. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, who's going to tell you a little bit more, and hopefully we'll have much less trouble with the bandwidth, about how you can actually engage with this agenda then in what you do. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Steph. So yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what this means for businesses and the actions that businesses can take. So firstly, Steph's already talked about this a bit, but why should businesses specifically care about biodiversity? So it kind of falls under two brackets. So firstly, around business resilience, so making sure that the risks associated with biodiversity loss don't impact on your business. So these types of risks can include supply chain risk, financial risk, legal or regulatory risk, and also reputational risk. So making sure that you're prepared and understand what those risks are and that you're putting things into action is really important. But then also there's a significant amount of opportunity in biodiversity, either through amending the activities that you do now, or also looking for opportunities to deliver completely new services that either support biodiversity through sort of direct actions or through new types of products and things that prevent the impact to biodiversity. So basically, it's really important. Additionally to those points, or sort of building on that regulation point, there's a lot of evolving environmental policy. I'm going to just touch on a few of these. This isn't a complete picture, and there are lots of others sort of emerging and evolving all the time. So firstly, science-based targets for nature is a best practice target setting methodology with final guidance to be released hopefully shortly. Then there's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a disclosure framework allowing you to report and act on nature-related risks. Then very recently, we've just had the EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. This is new legislation that looks at sustainable and responsible behaviour throughout global value chains. This covers both human rights and environmental issues, including things such as pollution and biodiversity loss. And I think it's important to note that even though this is an EU-based legislation, it does look globally, so it both looks at the global value chains of large corporations within the EU, so looking at where else they have impacts around the world, but also looks at the impacts of companies that are based outside of the EU but then have large operations or practices within the EU. So it does kind of impact a really large number of companies. And then there's also the Environment Act, which is England's specific environment legislation, which targets the recovery of the natural world within England and includes the 10% biodiversity net gain, which there's a lot of conversation about at the moment. So what should businesses do to try and tackle and meet this new requirement to become nature positive? So the first thing to do is to try and consider when biodiversity is a material issue to your business. So this comes from two lenses. So firstly, when is a business or an asset that you own is dependent on nature and biodiversity? So think around some of the services that Steph talked about earlier, so around direct harvesting from nature, or whether they're some of those more sort of broader ecosystem services such as pollination or water use. And then the other side of this is around business impact on biodiversity. So there's some really key drivers of biodiversity impact around land use change, climate change, pollution, overexploitation, and invasive species. So if your business either has dependence on nature or has an impact on nature through these different levers, then really need to be thinking about, okay, what are those and how do we sort of start working towards them? Once you've sort of, whilst you're thinking about materiality, one of the key things or the key ways you can do this and consider the materiality of your business is to look at it by sector. So some businesses just purely do one type of activity, so you can categorize that activity by a sector and then consider what the material issues are associated with that sector. But also you can look at businesses that are more complex and have multiple different types of activity within them, and then start to sort of look at each sector, and that might help you prioritize which parts of a business you want to go after first, or identify that you want to go after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different areas for different reasons perhaps. Key industries to consider are sort of forestry, agriculture, consumer products like clothing, utilities and construction. So there's a really wide range of different industries that are important and that will all have different impacts as well, and they might not always be completely obvious initially, so it is important to sort of dig into a bit more around some of those processes. For example, you've got with consumer products and clothing, you can have a range of different impacts dependent on the materials that are used to create those clothing, so sort of digging into that a bit more is really useful. So undertaking a sector level materiality assessment. So this is an example of how that could be done. So along the top, you've got the different impact drivers. So terrestrial ecosystem use, for example, or water use. And then on the left-hand side, you've got different sectors. So then in the center, you then have the materiality level of that impact driver against the different sectors, and those little sort of shapes they've got in the middle. So the circle in the center is the operations of that activity, and then the left-hand side arrow is the upstream and the right-hand side arrow shows the downstream. So basically highlighting that you need to think about the full value chain and that there are impacts across that, not just in your direct operations. So linking onto that, where does the biggest biodiversity footprint tend to lie, especially for large organisations? And it is in the supply chain. So while some industries or some companies might have their direct footprint is in their operations, a large proportion of companies really have it through their supply chain. They could have, say, 10, 20,000 suppliers, and really understanding where the impact lies across those and helping suppliers to reduce that impact can be really important to working towards those nature positive targets. So then on top of all the materiality stuff, looking at sectors, all of that, there is this spatial element to biodiversity impacts and dependencies. Biodiversity is not uniform, and the impacts that will happen will depend heavily on where the activity is located. So for example, a process that requires significant volumes of water will have a much greater impact in water stressed areas. The diagram on the right, or the image on the right, shows you a map where in the center you've got a manufacturing site, and then around it we've mapped some of the key biodiversity areas within a specified radius. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of, well, those green patches are nice biodiversity areas. So making sure, understanding the impact that that manufacturing site could potentially be having on those biodiversity areas through impact pathways is really sort of critical to understanding what your overall impact could be. If it was just a blank sheet of concrete, then your impact's probably going to be less, versus if you have a really important natural habitat that you are adjacent to or near to. So what tools are there to help you understand your materiality and develop actions? So the first step we would recommend in any sort of biodiversity piece of work that a company is undertaking is to do a baseline assessment. So this will identify where those impacts on nature are, as well as the dependencies and risks for the business lie. As we've said, these will occur across the value chain, and this really provides a foundation for prioritization of focus and also where those actions should lie. If, for example, you find that water use, you're using a significant amount of water, then looking at processes of how you could make a closed loop cycle or reduce water use generally could be a really good starting point. Additionally, sort of if you've got pollution or if you're using a lot of land, whether how you can reduce that or perhaps make areas that are suitable for nature to thrive in. There's also, as mentioned previously, the Science-Based Targets Network, which can then, once you've got your baseline, support you to develop targets that then you can set actions against and use to monitor progress. The aim would be to set these against the post-2020 biodiversity framework that Steph's talked through, with the aim of making us work towards being nature positive by 2030. Then we've got the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So TNFD is a framework for organisations to report and act on nature-related risks, with the aim of moving financial flows towards nature positive outcomes. This is around providing disclosure, essentially. So some of the key ways that you can provide that disclosure is through providing indications on how the governance is being managed, the strategies that your business is taking, that you're identifying and managing your interfaces with nature through risk and impact processes. And then that you've also set metrics and targets. So in many cases, the sort of TNFD, science-based targets, and also some around the natural capital stuff that we're not going to go into as much, that they all sort of interlink, and a lot of the methodologies have been set up to support each other and work with each other. So sort of bringing that together is a really useful way to companies to sort of accelerate through these processes. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on offsetting and investing in ecosystems. So hopefully once you sort of understand where your key impacts are, either that's at a high level or then going into a bit more detail about sort of values and amounts that are being used or impacted, is starting to think about offsetting and investing in nature. So a few things to consider around that is making sure that, well, it doesn't have to, but it is really good to make sure that investments in nature link to the areas that you are impacting. Then also offsetting does not replace reduction in impact. So we should all be making sure that we're doing reduction still, and we're preventing impact wherever possible, using mitigation hierarchy. But we do all rely on ecosystem services. So if we invest in those that we either use and have dependence on, or our communities have dependence on, is a good way to start sort of actioning through investment. And the time for action and investment is now. As Steph said, it's a really fast pace to try and get the progress towards being nature positive. Is only sort of 8 years, which is obviously not a very long time for businesses to really understand their impacts and then make all of that action happen. So I suppose what we're trying to say is that understand broadly and make sure your impacts, also your offsetting and investment, is targeted, but yeah, try and go for it sooner rather than later. So just to recap quickly at the end, some actions that you can take as businesses is to understand your dependence and impacts on nature, develop and implement measures to reduce those impacts, set targets of your biodiversity performance and plan to become nature positive, undertake disclosure, and then invest and contribute towards the post-2020 framework. As part of that, I think getting involved in the broader networks and some of the activities that Steph mentioned at the end of hers is a really great way to having greater impact. And that's finished.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you, Steph. Well done. It actually went all fine in the end once we could hear you, so don't worry. Hopefully it'll hold up long enough to answer some questions as well now. I'm going to have to do this. I'm having to admit defeat with the whole eyesight thing, unfortunately. So I think this first one would be for you, Steph. Why are you going to COP15, and what are you most looking forward to?
Why am I going? Initially I was going because I was going with a client whose supply chains we were working on in China. Now that's not really the case, but I'm there really to represent a couple of NGOs as well as RSK. So I'm representing SIME and the Mammal Society. So I've actually got access to the zone where the parties are negotiating, and the non-state actors do have an opportunity to raise points and ask questions. And last time I was at the most recent negotiations in Geneva, and that was a really valuable experience. And you know, various members from different national delegations came over to say how helpful they were finding that input from non-state actors to actually drive the negotiations forwards and get a feeling for what wider opinions were. So I think it's a really important thing to do. And what am I most looking forward to? Well, not the cold. I don't like cold. I don't like so, you know, Montreal in December is not my ideal. What am I looking forward to? I'm looking forward to some of the business events which are happening around the middle of the conference, which is probably around the same time that heads of states will be there as well. So it'll be really sort of buzzy and lots of excitement and enthusiasm for taking some of these actions forward.
That's good. I've got a sort of follow-up question, which there's a hint of skepticism here, maybe or cynicism rather, but it's how confident are you that we will achieve meaningful targets and then actually meet them?
Oh, yeah, that's, I'm an optimist by nature, so I'm confident that we will get some meaningful targets. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm around this. There's a lot of pressure from NGOs. And I think the text, there's a lot of brackets still in the text. It will be two quite dull weeks of arguing about the exact words in brackets. But I think there's a huge momentum towards agreeing something here because people realise how important it is. I can see us not getting everywhere. I can see us not completing everything and having all of the agreement as thorough as we'd like it. So I can see the next COP16 happening sooner than the standard 2-year period to try and keep the momentum going.
Okay, I think possibly, well, maybe for you, Catherine, but some of you can take it. Will TNFD be mandatory?
It's not currently mandatory, and it's not being released as a final version for probably another year or so. So probably won't be in that time period. But there is definitely an ambition that it would become mandatory alongside TCFD. I think the EU directive that we talked about sort of takes us part of that way around getting people to do reporting on it. So I think it's definitely a pathway for that to come about, but it's not quite there yet.
Okay, the next one I've got here is, again, I'm not sure one of you take it, is there a danger of leaping to offsetting or investing in nature?
I'll do that if you like. Yeah, I get that there's an issue around with carbon. There's very much an issue of people leaping to offsetting rather than dealing with their actual emissions first and reducing them as far as possible and then trying to claim carbon neutrality. It's not quite the same with biodiversity. Yes, you do want to be reducing your impacts on biodiversity as well, but some of what we're doing is not necessarily related to our impacts. It's relating to the bits of ecosystem services that we depend on. So it's not so much offsetting our impacts as reinvesting in those supply chains that support us, in those ecosystem services that we rely on. So I would definitely encourage businesses to start doing that straight away. Don't wait until you know every detail about your footprint and you've got your science-based target and you've got your TNFD disclosure ready, and then start giving back to nature. Start giving back to nature now, and we can always build that into the balance as we develop your position, your baseline, and your science-based targets going forward.
So don't wait for the perfect solution. We haven't got time. Need to get on with it.
Absolutely. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I've got probably a related one, but maybe for you, Catherine. If the methods aren't finished for TNFD or science-based targets, when should people think of starting these?
So you can start doing a lot of it now. So a lot of the work around baselining that we were talking about will massively feed into setting those targets and undertaking the disclosure. And actually, it's a really large proportion of the activity of being able to do those two things. So those sort of, a lot of that methodology exists now, and you can start looking into those sort of impacts and dependencies of your business. So we would definitely recommend just starting and having a look at where those impacts and dependencies lie for your business and start digging into that. And then that will definitely lead you into being able to set science-based targets and TNFD when the moment's right.
Okay, I'm probably coming back towards sort of COP in the next week or so, Steph. The question here is, has there been any talk of reparations for countries that are going to have suffered more than others from biodiversity loss? I guess in a similar way to the thing we were talking about at the COP, the climate change COP a few weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very similar process around loss and damage, but also around not necessarily again on the impact side and the loss and damage that has occurred, but more on the investing in the ecosystem services that we all rely on. So it's making sure that the people who are relying on commodities globally are inputting into protecting the Amazon rainforest, which is otherwise being damaged by the global demand for those commodities. So yeah, it is around diverting funds to more environmentally sustainable activities, but also it's thinking in a new way. It's thinking about natural capital accounting. It's thinking about ecosystem services. So you know, the fact that an elephant is worth about $40,000 dead to a poacher, but it's worth about $1.75 million alive in terms of the ecosystem services it delivers, in terms of the habitat modification it does, in terms of the carbon sequestered by its activity. And so it's getting people to think, how should the finance really be flowing? Well, it's got to be, if an elephant's worth more alive, then we should be channeling funding to keep elephants alive rather than letting elephant poaching continue and so forth. So it's thinking of new ways of making the finance flows work.
Absolutely. A bit conscious of time, so I think we'll take this as the last question for today. But just to remind people that if you want to keep adding questions, we will get back to them on the email. This final one then is, will we see emerging standards for various industries and sectors, e.g. bamboo, and how important will these be?
We certainly will. Yes, we're seeing some already, and within things like the science-based targets and TNFD work streams at the moment, there are specific industry and sector-based work streams. So yes, obviously some of these areas with bigger reliance or bigger impact on biodiversity are getting ahead of the game, so things like mining and agriculture and so forth. But yes, we are seeing people coming together to look at what best practice looks like as an industry, because it is something, you know, it's bigger than all of our businesses, and it's something that we all need to collaborate on rather than try to compete on.
Absolutely, a great point to end on, I think there. Thank you very much again to Steph and Catherine for today. Good luck, Steph, on your travels, and hopefully it will be a productive couple of weeks, and we will come out with something meaningful and achievable as a result of that. Possibly, thinking off the top of my head now, it's quite nice at some point in the new year to have you guys back to talk about what did happen and what the future does look like as a result of COP. So we'll put that in. That brings me quite neatly on to the fact that we're going to have a break in January from the First Thursday Club, and we will be back on the 2nd of February, and we will send out an email in the next couple of weeks outlining what that talk and webinar will be about, and so look out for that. Just to finish off then, we'll send out that questionnaire in the next day or so, so any input on that would be gratefully received. And all that leaves me to do now is to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, believe it or not, and we'll see you in 2023. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.